the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, because it felt, it's not too much to say, it felt like righting the wrongs of history. Europe had been divided against its will, and finally there was an opportunity to bring it together. And those countries were just so keen. They constantly said, we'll do whatever it takes, just tell us what to do and we'll do it. And I think the successful part was the economic integration. That has gone very well. It has lifted the living standards right across Eastern Europe. It has integrated them into the wider world trading system and into the European system in particular. But what we completely underestimated with hindsight was how long it takes to change political cultures, how long it takes to change political systems. And because even in 2004, the EU was still largely an economic entity, or that was where the bulk of the work was. I think we put too much emphasis on that, and we didn't put enough emphasis on things like the legal system, the court system, and what you saw was kind of shadowy figures having been swept aside in popular revolutions, but then coming back out of the shadows, and a lot of corruption coming in some countries. Now, I'm an optimist by nature, and looking at Poland and Hungary, I have always felt that these were, what has happened were kind of aberrations, and that they would come back in the end to sharing the values of the EUs that they joined. And I think that has proven to be the case in Poland, because I think not only the young people, but a lot of people in those countries, they want what the European Union has to offer. They don't want the alternatives that they're being served up now. But it's not easy for them to get to grips with it, and they have to solve it themselves. And I dealt a lot with Bulgaria and Romania, and it was very interesting to see at certain stages when the Romanians looked like they were going very heavily backwards. People just went out on the street and they said, this is not the kind of country we want to live in. We want the prosperity, but we also want the freedom where the state is not our enemy, where the state works for us and is our servant, and where we have faith in the legal system if we have to take cases, etc., etc. So I think all of that, those are long-term changes that maybe we are always too impatient. We want everything done nice and neat and tidy in a couple of years. But actually, it takes a very long time to change the culture of a country. I mean, looking at the Ireland that I left in the late 1970s, it was, poor, small, underdeveloped, and it's taken 50 years to get to the model of prosperity and reasonably socially liberal democracy that we have now. So we shouldn't expect it to go faster in the case of other countries. But and those countries also have to bring their particular contribution to bear in shaping the EU of the future. Now, I think the EU is going to be heavily absorbed with enlargement for the next 10 or 20 years, and will be bringing in poorer countries, which are a challenge because that will require more finance. But I think the EU has a good track record in terms of helping poorer countries integrate and become more prosperous. But this time we will learn the lesson. And if you look at Ukraine, if you will have a country that's divided with part of its territory occupied by Russia, that throws up all kinds of different problems. I mean, Ireland with our border has been difficult in the last few years, as everybody knows. Cyprus with its divided island. So the EU is not very keen to have to import, let's say, border disputes inside the EU as part of its membership. And I think, just a challenge of trying to integrate a country the size of Ukraine will be bigger than it has been in the past. But I am absolutely confident that these are the kind of problems that there's a lot of talented people around who can do it. But it will take sustained political will from successive governments as well to make it happen.
And you've spoken before about your pride in the EU being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, for the successful struggle for peace, reconciliation, democracy, and human rights. I mean, just going back to what you were just saying, I mean, does that imply that, say, that the process of accession should have been sort of had more stringent criteria, that there should have been, I don't know, the chapters in the in the acquis should have been enforced more, or and the process should have been longer? Or, I mean, thinking about the situation in Hungary and Poland as it was, that they looked like countries that weren't meeting the Copenhagen criteria for accession.
Well, this is partly a technocratic process and it's partly a political process. And you get to a stage in negotiations, it seems, that when everybody is fed up and just says, oh, let's get on with it and do it. And also, I think there's a concern about countries having reform fatigue if they don't, make it to the final hurdle. I think that's actually dangerous. But I think that's how the member state politicians see it. So there was certainly a desire to have a big bang enlargement then, and to bring in some who were not as ready as others. So you had Bulgaria and Romania joining 3 years later. You had Croatia then got caught up in a kind of ex post realization, oh, what have we done? And had to wait until 2013, I think. So I think we have to learn lessons from all of this. Now, having said that, I think that there are times in life when you have to make a political leap, and that's for the prime ministers to decide. And the kind of problems that you have can be solved afterwards as well. But what doesn't work is if they want to make the great leap ahead and say, okay, sort it out afterwards, but they don't give you the resources to do it. That's a problem.
Yeah.
So I think the EU has learned a lot. There is something about the eternal optimism of the institutions in Brussels, who always think the member states are going to behave. And why do I say that? I say, in the Treaty of Rome, you had the procedure of taking infringement proceedings against member states. And in the beginning, if any member state got a letter from the Commission saying you're breaking the law, this is not correct, they would immediately say, oh my God, we have to correct it immediately. Then gradually they got more brazen, and you got to the stage where you had to take member states to court, which was terrible. And then you had to take them to court a second time, and then you had to fine them. And Article 7, which says that you can take away the voting rights of a member state that goes off the rails and doesn't adhere to the values, that was supposed to be the nuclear deterrent. But nobody could ever imagine that two member states would go off the rails and support each other and thereby negate the provisions of the article. I personally think the European institutions should have taken action sooner and been tougher with Poland and Hungary. But that was not what the prime ministers wanted. They wanted to give more time, more time. Now they've eventually lost patience. And as I say, Poland has also, let's say, come back to the mainstream of wanting to abide by the Copenhagen criteria. So we'll see what happens next. But it's not, there's something wrong when every new treaty has to put in even more stringent requirements on the member states to actually live up to what they're signing up to. We have to have an adult conversation about that at some stage too, I think.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we move on to talk about Brexit, Paul, is there anything coming from social media that you want to pick up on?
Just picking up on that point about populism and the kind of ongoing conflict between populist enterprises and the EU's response. What's your kind of expectation in the near term as to how that's going to play out in terms of upcoming elections? And do you think that what's your opinion of the kind of current EU strategy with that?
I think by its nature, the EU is fairly centrist, because there's no one leader, which is a good thing in my view, because then you don't have either one particular ideology or one particular personality dominating. And they have to find a middle ground of compromise in order to advance. So that makes it slower to decide, which can be frustrating internally and for partners. But I think it is actually a kind of safety valve. So I think when you look at across all of the countries, yes, there are right-wing movements in quite a few countries, but some of them are successful in the polls. Some are less successful than the opinion polls would actually make you think. I think we just have to wait and see. I think there will be probably more far right people in the next European Parliament, but exactly how many and from which countries, that we'll have to wait and see. But I do, having been there for so long, I do see as well that people can campaign in a harder way, that when they come into government, the complexity of the decisions they have to take and the fact that they need others to help them to achieve their objectives, that does tend again to push people towards the centre. So I'm not trying to say that it's not good. It's a particularly important election, and I'm quite worried about in some countries about what kind of politics will it result in. But I do think that there is that tendency to kind of draw people towards the centre as being the only place where they can actually operate and function. So I'm pinning my hopes on that.
Yeah, well, it's always good to hear an optimistic outlook in the current climate. Just picking up on the Brexit issue. I mean, here in the UK, we've ended up really pretty much with the hardest possible Brexit on Michel Barnier's famous steps, and that was on the back of, well, an advisory referendum, but which also didn't say what leave actually meant. I mean, sometimes we were being assured we would stay in the single market and nothing much would change. And there's been some discussion about whether having a citizens' assembly could have been a good way to have addressed the issue of how the UK responded to the referendum result. And it's something that Ireland's got quite a lot of experience with, and I know that you've recently chaired the assembly on gender equality, and I wonder if what are your thoughts on how and how well this process works, and whether it's something that could have delivered benefits on a complex question like how to Brexit.
Having been through one myself, I'm a big fan of citizens' assemblies, because what they do is they give people the time to get information, to debate and change their ideas, and then come out with recommendations to government. And they are only recommendations. Where I think they have been particularly successful in Ireland has been on difficult social issues like marriage equality and like abortion, where the politicians didn't know how to read public opinion. And as it turned out, we're quite far behind public opinion. So I think that process of providing information and time and space to not just rush to an immediate knee-jerk reaction to a question, but to actually tease it out with people on an informed basis, I think that's very good. Now, we've just had a failed referendum last Friday on two questions which came out. Not part of the problem, I think, is the government didn't follow what the citizens recommended. So if you like, again, they didn't read the citizens right, but there were a lot of other complications as well there. So it's not a failed safe model, let's say. But I do think however you do it, you need to find a way on something as complex as the EU. And this goes for all the existing member states as well. I think they really need to do more to explain and to, demystify the EU, to explain what it's all about. And then if you do have a referendum, but also if you're making a big policy change, you absolutely need full and informed commitment and engagement from the political level. And very often in all of the European countries, the politicians are a bit shy or feel uncomfortable having to kind of explain things that they know or that they're going to agree with and that are good for their country, but that, they know they will get some brickbats as well. And I think we have to get over that. If the EU is as important as they all know it is, then they've got to have the courage of their convictions and be prepared to tackle the difficult issues and explain to people. And I mean, what I found in the Citizens' Assembly was when people had the information and when they heard other views, they were prepared to be quite reasonable. You know, they would say they would understand if something was going to take 5 or 10 years to happen, but they wanted it to start now. They didn't want it to stay in the ether because it was difficult. So I think we have to have a bit more trust in our citizens, but not just trust, but to give them the information and then be prepared to debate. So something, whether it's a citizens' assembly or something else, but I think that that is a need inside the EU. We used to always say you can't kind of, be negative about the EU from Monday to Saturday and then expect people to go out and vote on Sunday in favor. You have to give them reasons to support it. And unfortunately, I do think Brexit has been, if you like, the biggest recruiting sergeant for the EU, because every European country now has seen what you can lose if you don't have it. But that's a kind of negative lesson, if you like. And I would like, for them to step up to the plate more on the positive messages, because all ministers and MEPs have got to make a decision. Do they support something or do they not support it? So they have to have gone through a reasoning process. Why not share their reasoning and also come clean with people and say, look, it's not perfect. We would have liked something that was closer to our system, but it's much more important to get the whole of Europe moving on this. And that's why we made a compromise and defend the decisions that they're actually taking.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, Paul, do you have anything that you want to chip in?
Well, I was just going to ask, obviously, we're obsessed about, because of Brexit, our relationship with the EU and how that may develop in the future. But we're also interested in what do you think has been the effect of Brexit on Ireland's relationship with the EU?
It's been very difficult. I think it has proved to us again that we have made the right decision to stay in. But as the closest neighbour, as the country that we think we know best, where we share English as a language, etc., that loss of closeness has been very, very difficult. And even on Anglo-Irish relations, where it was so easy for the prime ministers when they were in Brussels, or every minister would be in and out of Brussels to meet their opposite number and to discuss not just the British-Irish issues, but in the broader context of supporting each other on, votes or policy discussions or whatever. So that loss is gone. I think Ireland and the whole EU has lost a lot of the British expertise, because the UK could be a pain in the neck about asking complicated questions about, well, exactly how will it work and what will it cost and where will it, why will it happen on this day? But it made everybody think about the consequences of the proposals before they implemented them. And I think with the huge technical expertise that the UK has in so many areas, that is a significant loss for the EU. So I do think that the EU very much wants a closer relationship with the UK. And I think we will be able to build it in the coming years. It can't be an kind of membership light. But I think that because of history and geography and politics, I think that we will have to find a better way of working together. And if you think about the big issues now, like defence, which is something that's a big concern for the UK and for the EU, that's an obvious area where we could cooperate more closely together. Also on trade, where it was the first time in my life I had seen the EU prepared to give more to the partner it was negotiating with than the partner wanted. So there's obviously room to build closer relationships there. It's wonderful that the UK has come back into Horizon Europe, again, bringing all that scientific expertise and research capacity, from which it will benefit, but also other European countries will benefit. So I can see lots of areas where we could have a closer relationship. And if we go step by step on that, we don't have to decide that there is any end destination. It just makes sense for countries that are close to each other and largely share the same values and are subject to the same pressures and the same problems, that we would work more closely together.
I mean, that crosses over really with what was going to be my last question, because now we have. I mean, I have the impression, in spite of what you say, that the EU is kind of has moved on from Brexit in a way that the UK hasn't. Really, we're still it's still extremely divisive in our politics. Our two main political parties don't want to discuss it, in spite of the gaping hole it's left in public finances, and in spite of the day-to-day difficulties that many businesses face. And there's now a clear and fairly stable majority who would vote to rejoin the EU. So that's not just people who think it's a mistake, but we can't fix it, but people who would actively vote to rejoin. Now, I mean, obviously, it takes much more than for the UK to change its mind. What would it need on the EU side, or is it a question of picking the things that we can cooperate on, choosing areas where there's something that the UK can bring to the table, and working on a sort of like a fairly piecemeal case by case basis?
Well, as I said, I really do believe that the EU is open to having a closer relationship, to be defined, between it and the UK. I have to say, in all honesty, I don't think rejoining is an issue at all on the EU side. I think it's simply, if the UK said tomorrow, we want to come back, I don't think the EU would be jumping for joy, because I don't think that there has been a change of approach in the UK. Maybe it's too soon, maybe it'll never happen. But I mentioned earlier that all the current members of the EU know and believe that their country has to stay in the EU for the future, that it's a vital part of who they are in the modern world. I don't think that is the prevailing majority view in the UK, as far as I can see from the media and from talking to people. But I don't think it matters. I think, and in a way, it's a kind of something that came up often when the UK was a member. The UK always wanted to know, well, what's the destination? Whereas all the others were happy to get on the train and say, well, we're going along together and we'll see where the next station is, and maybe there'll be one after that. So I think, until the UK has this kind of, which it may never have, kind of conversion to seeing itself as a small country, small European country, who has to have the bigger surroundings of the EU in order for itself to prosper and to matter in the world, I don't think the EU will open the door again. But that's a time scenario that can be very long. But I'm equally sure that the EU will want to have closer relations with the UK. And maybe we have to learn about each other again, because Britain has been changed by Brexit too. So maybe closer working together over a long term will persuade the UK, okay, this is fine, this is as far as we want to go. Or maybe it will persuade another generation that, actually, we'd rather be inside, because this is where we have to be. This is our natural place. But I don't think we have to ask those questions. I can understand why people, especially people who never wanted to leave, would feel, oh, please, welcome us back with open arms. But I think having left, and I don't think that the UK fully understands the hurt and the kind of trauma that it caused on the EU side, because you were so busy being consumed with your own hurt and trauma. Yeah. But, from even what it did to the groupings in the European Parliament, life has become easier in some ways without the UK. So, there'll be all kinds of reasons why the EU would be very wary, but that doesn't mean that we can't have much closer relations. And either in the end it will work itself out, or maybe it won't matter much in the end, So
yeah, I mean,
concentrate on the next 10 years
lending,
rather than.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of lending there was under the next generation EU package, it's difficult to imagine could have been pulled together so quickly if the UK had still been a member at that, at that point. And yeah,
also being part of the euro is now a condition of membership. So and that would be another big one to swallow, I think. But
yes, yeah.
Let's see, let's not close off any avenues or nail our colours too firmly to any particular mast, because I think the important thing is that we find ways back to each other. We for all the angst, we did work extremely well together. Could we not pick up some of that again and work well together while respecting the different decisions that there have been?
Listen, it's great to end on an optimistic note, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time and knowledge and expertise. It's been really fascinating discussion. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I've enjoyed it too. Thank you very much.